Welcome to our video blog series. My name is Tom Fulmer, and today we're going to be talking about what happens if you fail a drug test. And joining us for our video today is Mr. Joe Riley, President of National Drug Screening. He's been in the industry since 1993. He served as an expert witness. He's seen a lot of evolution of changes in laws, regulations, rules, trends, and he's going to share some of his expertise with us today.
Thank you, Tom. And that's an interesting topic because just last year in workplace drug testing, there were more positive drug tests. More people failed a drug test than ever before.
Yeah, and that's a disturbing trend that's going to continue to go on, as well as the increasing number of workplace overdoses and things like that that go just above and beyond that. So the first thing is, if someone does test positive, quite often employers don't know what to do. So how do they handle that from an employer's perspective if they get this positive result on either a drug or alcohol test? What would their steps be, or what steps should they take?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. Good question. So when someone fails a drug test, we talk about it being an applicant or a current employee. If it's an applicant, first off, we should not have tested them until we made an offer of employment. The offer of employment is conditional upon the passing of the drug test. So if the applicant fails the drug test, we withdraw the offer of employment. No questions asked, no second chances. Now, if it's an existing employee that fails a drug test, we need to go back to our drug-free workplace policy. Now, if we don't have a policy, we got a little bit of a challenge because we never told people that the use of drugs was prohibited, because we didn't have a policy that told them that. So at that point, I typically would advise employers to put a policy together right now, and you probably want to look at a second chance policy because you never said that you're going to be terminated if you fail a drug test. If you do have a policy, and that's the good news, then you follow your policy. Typically, policies will say immediate termination. They'll say we do a second chance, which means we might enter into a second chance agreement with that employee and say, okay, you failed the drug test. We're going to let you keep your job if you do the following. And then that second chance agreement outlines, okay, you've got to get some help for the substance abuse issue. You've got to go to rehab potentially. You've got to go to AA potentially. You've got to go to our employee assistance program. There's some performance issues that we have to address. There's some attendance issues, tardiness issues, whatever it is. And that can change from one employee to another. So there's not really a set template for a second chance agreement. Now, thirdly, I see in a lot of policies, not the ones that I guide folks on, but I see a lot of policies where they say, if you fail the drug test, you will receive disciplinary action up to including termination. So what does that mean? Well, we let John keep his job and we terminate Mary. That's where companies can run into problems with a failed drug test.
Right, and that really does vary too a little bit if the employee happens to be DOT regulated and it's a DOT regulated test, because it may be a regulated employee but not a DOT test, or it may be one that is a DOT, and that dramatically affects what your steps you take.
Sure.
To some degree.
Absolutely, Tom. Yeah. So DOT regulated companies, transportation industries, trucking companies, airlines, railroads, etc., they're required by DOT to have a drug and alcohol testing program. That program requires certain things. Mainly, if there's a positive drug test or a positive alcohol test, that person must be removed from the safety-sensitive position that they're operating in, driving a truck, flying an airplane. They must be removed from that position. They must see a substance abuse professional, go through a program before they can come back to work into any safety-sensitive position. Now, DOT doesn't tell the employer, fire the person or not fire them or give them a second chance or don't give them a second chance. All that comes back to what does the company policy say. So with DOT regulated employers, one, you remove the person from the safety sensitive position immediately, no questions asked. Two, you follow your policy Are you going to terminate them, or are you going to keep them on board in some other capacity until they go through the substance abuse professional program?
Yeah, and since you brought up, second chance agreement and a couple of those, a lot of employers I think may be confused about that. They're not sure if they want to do that because they may have the impression that they have to pay for something, although they may do that. So how does that typically work with employers, and do they have an option as far as that goes?
Sure. So a second chance agreement typically requires that the employee get some type of assistance for the substance abuse issue that has now been identified by the positive drug test. That typically leads to an EAP program, an employee assistance program. And many companies have an EAP program available where the employee can get confidential help for substance abuse. Many times those EAP programs are included in the company's health insurance, which often that's a secret. So it's really good to know that if you have EAP included in your health insurance, to make that well known with your employees. Now, smaller companies may not have an EAP program, may not have health insurance that includes an EAP program, but at a minimum, and when we write policies, we provide a resource page. So at a minimum, provide a resource page. Here's a list of resources, national hotline numbers, websites, local facilities that offer education, treatment, assistance for a substance abuse problem. Now, the company, and their policies should state this up front, is under no obligation to pay for substance abuse treatment. The company can also require follow-up testing when the person comes back to work to make sure that they stay clean. And part of that second chance agreement, they can require the employee to pay for those follow-up drug tests. So if you have a second chance policy, it doesn't mean you're going to incur expenses.
Well, that's very interesting. I think a lot of employers probably didn't realize that, so I really appreciate your sharing that. I know that may come up some more in specific states too, because there are some states that may not allow termination on a first drug test offense. And so having that policy in place and making sure it's compliant is really important, since that does vary state by state. It's not just one generic one that, unlike a lot of employers think you can just pull off the internet and fill in the blank and you're covered. It's not that case, right?
Absolutely, Tom. And, state laws vary from state to state to state, all 51 states around the whole country. And there are a handful of states that require that you cannot terminate someone on a first offense of a positive drug test, that you have to have a second chance agreement. So in every state, no matter where an employer is located, when they're writing their policy, or if you're getting ready to revise your policy, work with an expert, work with a professional that can identify what the laws are in the state that you're in, so that you don't write a policy or take actions that violate state laws that can now cause liability and potential damages in a lawsuit.
Well, and that's what we've been focusing on the employer side of things, where there are a lot of areas there. Are there any things from the employee's side that they would need to consider or take action on, or that you think might be helpful to address?
Well, that's interesting, Tom, because we started off the conversation talking about what happens if you fail a drug test. So on the employee side of things, what happens with the employee? So what's really quite interesting also is that the employee typically knows that they failed the drug test before the employer knows. Because in the drug testing process, the medical review officer or the MRO, when they get the lab result, they'll call the employee and they'll say, John, you tested positive. Is there any medical explanation? Do you have a prescription? And if John has one, that'll be reviewed and verified, reported as negative. But for some drugs like cocaine and marijuana, there is no prescription. Or if they're taking Oxycontin and they don't have a prescription. So the employee now knows that they've tested positive. And the employer is going to get a report, follow up on that. But the employee may, not show back up to work. They may go back to work and tell everybody they tested positive. which is not a good thing, but a lot of times they do that. But what I would advise is, they're probably going to get called in to see their boss or to see HR, and they're going to be told they tested positive, which they know already. And I would just advise that they ask, okay, I tested positive. What does the company policy say?
Right. And I think, we have some situations too that are a little bit more rare that, somebody doesn't get back to touch with the MRO. They get a positive result, but maybe they really did have a legitimate prescription. The instance of being of one person who went on a 7-day cruise literally the day after taking the drug test. And so do they have any recourse for that? And two, if they want to contest, if they tested positive and that wasn't the situation and they wanted to contest it, what are the options that an individual might have?
Yeah, Tom, so 2 things there. Every employee that tests positive has an option to contest that result. And there's only one way to contest it, okay? They work with the MRO and they say, hey, there's no way I tested positive. I never used drugs. Okay. We can take the specimen that's at the laboratory that tested positive and we can send it to another laboratory and see what that laboratory finds. Now, in my experience, going back over 20 years, 98% of the time, the same result. They're still positive. What employees like to say is, hey, I never used drugs. I'll go back again. Let me go back next week for another test. That's not an option. What was in their urine today may not be in their urine next week. Now, the other part of the question, Tom, is what happens if they didn't get back with the MRO? So the MRO left them a message, and maybe they're on a cruise like you mentioned, or maybe they don't understand why an MRO is calling them, and all of a sudden they get called into the office and they're told, you have a positive drug test. And they're thinking to themselves, well, that's impossible. And they ask, well, what was I positive for? And, well, you were positive for opiates. You were positive for codeine. And then they remember, oh my goodness, I have a prescription for codeine. And then they have an opportunity to recontact the MRO. And employers should know this because they can recontact the MRO because they did in fact have a legitimate medical explanation for that positive drug test. Now the MRO is going to review that, they're going to verify it with the pharmacy, and they're going to provide an updated, changed result to the employer. And the employer has to accept that because, if they don't accept it and they fire the person and the person goes to court and they put a laboratory expert on the stand and they put the MRO on the stand and everybody says, well, yeah, positive for codeine, positive for codeine and positive for codeine. But lo and behold, there's also a prescription for codeine. So the person didn't really violate the company policy.
Yeah, I think that comes down to being very clear and communicating with your employees, too, that you had mentioned earlier, how important that is.
Absolutely.
So they understand that as part of that drug testing process. They understand what their options are and their responsibilities are to really, make sure those situations don't arise because that can create issues.
Yeah, education about your policy, following your policy, being aware of your policy is critical.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joe, for joining us there. Mr. Joe Riley with National Drug Screening, joining us and sharing some insights on what happens if you fail a drug test and some of the things you can do as an employer and responsibilities as an employee. So appreciate your sharing that with us today.
Thanks for being here, Tom. I enjoyed that topic very much.
Yep. And I want to invite you to visit our video blog series on the NDS blog at www.nationaldrugscreening.com. We have a great wealth of information for accurate answers to all of your drug testing questions, everything from videos to articles to current news updates to keep you on top of things going on and related to you. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video.